Ago, in a village deep within the lush forests of what is now southwestern Nigeria, there was a man named Olamide, but everyone called him Olamide. Olamide was a slave, owned by a wealthy and powerful man named Chief Adeyemi. Chief Adeyemi was not just wealthy, he was influential, feared, and respected by everyone in the village and beyond. His compound was the largest in the village, surrounded by tall trees and guarded by fierce warriors. Chief Adeyemi was a man who loved to show off his wealth and power, and among his many slaves, Olamide was the most talked about. Olamide was unlike any other man in the village. From the moment he was born, there was something different about him. As he grew, his uniqueness became more apparent, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had become the subject of every woman's fantasies and every man's envy. Olamide was tall, standing over 6 feet, with a body sculpted like a deity. His skin was the color of rich, dark chocolate, smooth and unblemished, with a natural sheen that made him look like he had been kissed by the gods themselves. His face was a masterpiece, strong, chiseled jawline, high cheekbones, and full lips that always seemed to be on the verge of a knowing smile. His eyes were dark and intense, filled with a depth that seemed to draw people in, making them feel as though he could see straight into their souls. His hair, thick and curly, framed his face perfectly, adding to his allure. But it wasn't just his face that made him so irresistible. Olamide's body was a work of art. Broad shoulders that could carry the weight of the world, arms thick with muscle, and a chest so powerful it seemed as if it had been carved from stone. His waist was narrow, leading down to strong legs that spoke of both power and grace. But it was what lay between his legs that truly captured the attention of the women in the village. Olamide had a bulge in his pants that was impossible to ignore. It was a promise, a hint of the pleasure he could bring, and the women who caught sight of it could not help but fantasize about what it would be like to feel him inside them. Olamide moved with a confidence that was both natural and overwhelming. He was aware of the effect he had on people, especially women, but he never boasted about it. He didn't need to. The way he walked, the way he spoke in his deep, smooth voice, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long on the women he passed, all of it was enough to drive them wild. The young girls in the village would giggle and whisper behind their hands as he walked by, while the older women, though more discreet, could not hide the longing in their eyes. The whispers about Olamide's prowess began long before Chief Adeyemi noticed him. The village women talked amongst themselves, sharing stories of how just being near Olamide made them feel things they had never felt before. Some said it was his touch, others his voice, but the truth was that everything about Olamide was designed to seduce. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting a golden glow over the village, Olamide was working in Chief Adeyemi's compound. The chief, a man of great wealth and power, owned many slaves, but none like Olamide. As Olamide moved through the compound, his muscles rippling under his dark skin, the chief's wives watched him from the shadows. They had heard the rumors, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. They watched as he lifted heavy loads with ease, the veins in his arms bulging with each movement, and they could not help but imagine what it would be like to feel those strong arms around them. Chief Adeyemi was no fool. He had noticed the way the women in his compound looked at Olamide, the way their conversations would stop when he entered a room, and the way they would quickly avert their eyes, blushing and giggling like schoolgirls. The chief was a man who valued power, and he understood that Olamide had a power unlike any other. He knew that he could use Olamide's gift to his advantage. One day, Chief Adeyemi called Olamide into his hut. The chief was a large man, with a presence that filled the room, but even he could not help but feel a slight twinge of envy as he looked at Olamide standing before him, tall, strong, and undeniably handsome. "Olamide," Chief Adeyemi said, his voice deep and commanding, I hear say you get one kind power where no other man get for this village." Olamide, who had learned long ago that humility was his greatest weapon, bowed his head slightly. "Yes, my master," he replied in a voice that was both respectful and filled with quiet confidence. Chief Adeyemi studied him for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "From today, your work no go be just to carry load or do farm work. You go day help me in another way," the chief continued. "You go day impregnate my slave women. I want make my household full of strong children's way go carry my name and work for me." Olamide understood the gravity of the chief's words. He knew that his life was about to change, that he was being asked to do something that could bring both pleasure and danger. But he also knew that as a slave, he had no choice. What his master asked, he had to do. The first woman Olamide was sent to was Amoke, a young slave woman who had only recently come into Chief Adeyemi's household. Amoke was beautiful in her own right, with skin the color of mahogany and eyes that sparkled like stars in the night sky. But she was shy, unused to the attention of men, and when Olamide was brought to her, she blushed deeply, unsure of what to expect. Olamide could sense her nervousness, and he approached her with the gentleness of a lion stalking its prey. He spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her that she had nothing to fear, that he would take care of her. And as he spoke, he slowly reached out to touch her hand, feeling the softness of her skin under his fingers. Amoke trembled at his touch, her heart racing as she looked into his deep, dark eyes. Without saying a word, Olamide pulled Amoke closer to him, his large hands resting on her waist. She could feel the heat of his body, the strength in his arms, and she felt a wave of desire wash over her. Olamide leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips, a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. Amoke gasped, surprised by the sensation, but she did not pull away. Instead, she melted into him, letting him take control. Olamide's hands moved down to her hips, pulling her even closer, and Amoke could feel the hardness of his bulge pressing against her. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Olamide lifted her easily, carrying her to the bed where he laid her down gently. He took his time, undressing her slowly, savoring the sight of her body as it was revealed to him. Amoke's breath came in short gasps as she watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. When Olamide finally undressed himself, Amoke's eyes widened in awe. He was magnificent, every muscle perfectly defined, every inch of him exuding power and masculinity. But it was the sight of his bulge, now fully revealed, that truly took her breath away. It was even larger than she had imagined, and she couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement at the thought of what was to come. Olamide moved over her, his body covering hers, and Amoke felt a wave of heat between her legs. She knew what was about to happen, and she was ready for it. As Olamide entered her, she let out a soft moan, feeling a pleasure unlike anything she had ever experienced. Olamide moved slowly at first, letting her adjust to his size, but soon he began to pick up the pace, driving deeper and harder with each thrust. Amoke's moans grew louder, her body arching beneath him as she lost herself in the sensation. She could feel every inch of him inside her, filling her completely, and she knew that she would never be the same again. Olamide was relentless, his movements precise and controlled, but filled with passion. He knew exactly how to bring a woman to the edge, how to make her beg for more, and he did just that. By the time they were finished, Amoke was exhausted, her body trembling with the aftershocks of pleasure. Olamide laid beside her, his breathing steady, and for a moment, they simply lay there in silence, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind outside. Word of Olamide's encounter with Amoke spread quickly through the village. The women talked amongst themselves, sharing every detail they could gather, and soon every woman in the village was longing for a chance to be with Olamide. The other slave women, who had once viewed Amoke with a hint of pity for being new and inexperienced, now looked at her with a mixture of envy and curiosity. They noticed the way she walked, her newfound confidence, the glow that seemed to emanate from her. It wasn't long before they began to whisper among themselves, each one secretly hoping that they would be the next to experience what Amoke had. Chief Adeyemi, ever the shrewd businessman, was quick to recognize the growing demand for Olamide's services. He began to send Olamide to other slave women in his compound, ensuring that each one would bear him a child. But the chief's ambitions didn't stop there. He saw an opportunity to profit from Olamide's gift and began renting him out to other wealthy men in the village who wanted their slave women to bear strong children. Olamide became a man in high demand, moving from one compound to another, each time leaving behind a trail of women who were left both satisfied and longing for more. The slave women were not the only ones who noticed Olamide's abilities. The wives of the wealthy men, who had often felt neglected and unsatisfied in their marriages, began to take a keen interest in Olamide. They had heard the stories, and they were eager to see for themselves if the rumors were true. It started with furtive glances as Olamide walked through the village, the way the women would watch him from behind the curtains of their huts, their eyes following the sway of his hips, the bulge in his pants. They would gather together under the pretense of social visits, but the conversation would inevitably turn to Olamide. They would giggle like young girls, their cheeks flushing with excitement and embarrassment as they discussed what they had heard about him. But for some, mere talk was not enough. Madam Kemi, Chief Adeyemi's youngest wife, was the first to act on her curiosity. She had always been bold, unafraid to go after what she wanted, and she wanted Olamide. She had seen the way the other women in the compound looked at him, the way they seemed to come alive in his presence, and she wanted to experience that for herself. One evening, when Chief Adeyemi was away on business, Madam Kemi sent for Olamide. She was nervous, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to arrive. But she was determined. She had heard too many stories, had seen too many women transformed by Olamide, and she could no longer resist the pull. When Olamide entered her hut, Madam Kemi felt a shiver run down her spine. He was even more handsome up close, his presence filling the small room. She could barely breathe as he approached her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her feel both excited and afraid. She had never felt anything like this before. "Olamide," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I have heard so much about you. I want to know if it is all true." Olamide, ever the gentleman, simply smiled, his lips curving into that knowing smile that had driven so many women wild. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her body. "Madam Kemi," he said in that deep, soothing voice of his, "I will show you things you have never felt before." Madam Kemi's breath caught in her throat as Olamide pulled her close, his hands resting on her waist. She could feel the strength in his grip, the heat of his body, and the hardness of his bulge pressing against her. She let out a soft moan as he kissed her, his lips gentle but insistent, demanding a response. Olamide took his time with Madam Kemi, undressing her slowly, savoring the sight of her body as it was revealed to him. She was beautiful, with soft, smooth skin and curves that were made for a man's hands. But it wasn't just her beauty that excited Olamide. It was the way she responded to him, the way her body seemed to melt under his touch. When Olamide finally entered her, Madam Kemi let out a cry of pleasure, her body arching beneath him. She had never felt anything like this before, had never been with a man who could make her feel so completely desired, so utterly fulfilled. Olamide moved with a skill and precision that left her breathless, his every touch, every thrust, designed to bring her to the edge of ecstasy. Madam Kemi lost herself in the sensation, her moans filling the room as Olamide drove her higher and higher. She could feel every inch of him inside her, filling her completely, and she knew that she would never be able to look at her husband the same way again. Olamide was relentless, his movements growing more intense as he pushed her to the brink of pleasure. When it was over, Madame Kemi lay beside Olamide, her body trembling with the aftershocks of pleasure. She couldn't believe what had just happened, couldn't believe that she had just experienced the most intense pleasure of her life with a man who was not her husband. But as she looked at Olamide, at the satisfied smile on his lips, she knew that she would do it again, that she would risk everything for another night with him. Madame Kemi was not the only one who fell under Olamide's spell. The other wives of the wealthy men, who had heard the stories and seen the change in Madame Kemi, began to seek him out as well. Each one was drawn to him like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the temptation of experiencing what so many others had. Olamide found himself in a dangerous web of lies and deceit as he juggled the demands of these powerful women, each one wanting to keep their encounters with him hidden from their husbands. He knew the risks, knew that if he was caught, the consequences would be severe. But Olamide was a master of his craft, and he knew how to keep his secrets safe. The women would meet him in secret, in the dead of night, slipping away from their husbands' beds to find him. They would come to him, trembling with anticipation, their bodies aching for his touch. And Olamide, ever the skilled lover, would give them what they desired. Each encounter was different, each woman bringing her own unique desires and fantasies to the table. Some wanted to be dominated, to be taken forcefully and without mercy. Others wanted to be worshipped, to be treated like queens, their bodies adored and cherished. Olamide could do it all, and he did, leaving each woman breathless and satisfied, her heart racing with the thrill of the forbidden. But as the months passed, the number of pregnant women in the village began to grow, and the men started to notice. Their wives, who had once been distant and cold, were now glowing with happiness, their bellies swelling with new life. But what troubled the men even more was the fact that some of the children born looked nothing like their fathers. The whispers grew louder, and soon the entire village was talking about Olamide. The men began to connect the dots, realizing that the one common factor among all these pregnancies was Olamide. Anger and jealousy burned in their hearts as they realized that the slave they had once admired and envied had betrayed them in the worst possible way. Chief Adeyemi, who had once been so proud of Olamide, now felt a deep sense of shame. He could no longer ignore the rumors that his own wife, Madame Kemi, had also been with Olamide. The final blow came when one of the village elders, whose daughter had recently given birth to a child that looked suspiciously like Olamide, demanded justice. The village was in chaos. The men gathered in secret meetings, their faces twisted with rage as they discussed what to do. The women, who had once seen Olamide as a source of pleasure and escape, now feared for their lives. They knew that if their husbands and fathers found out the truth, the punishment would be severe. One night, the men of the village, led by Chief Adeyemi and the elders, stormed into Chief Adeyemi's compound. They dragged Olamide out of his hut and took him to the village square. The people gathered, their faces filled with anger and fear. The men shouted and cursed, demanding justice for the chaos Olamide had caused. "Olamide," one of the elders said, his voice cold and hard, "you done spoil our village with your wicked ways. You no go fit, stay here again. From today we dey banish you from this village. If we see you near here again, na death go meet you." Olamide, knowing that his time had come, did not fight or argue. He simply lowered his head in acceptance. The crowd continued to shout insults, their voices a mix of anger and betrayal. They had once admired Olamide for his strength and charm, but now, all they could see was a man who had disrupted the peace of their village, a man who had caused shame and heartache in so many homes. Chief Adeyemi, who had once proudly claimed Olamide as his most valuable possession, now felt a deep sense of guilt and humiliation. His own wife had been caught up in Olamide's charm, and the child she carried might not even be his. The other men in the village shared his pain, each one wondering if the children in their homes were truly theirs. The seeds of doubt and jealousy had been planted deep, and the once peaceful village was now fractured by suspicion and mistrust. The men, driven by their wounded pride and the fear of being cuckolded, knew that Olamide had to be removed to restore some semblance of order to their lives. The men of the village, their hearts heavy with betrayal, took Olamide to the edge of the village where the thick forest began. The trees loomed tall and dark, casting long shadows under the moonlight. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Chief Adeyemi, standing at the front of the group, looked at Olamide with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Olamide had once been his most prized possession, the man who had brought him so much wealth and status. But now, all he could see was the man who had brought shame to his household, who had violated the trust of every man in the village. "Olamide," Chief Adeyemi began, his voice trembling slightly. "You were like a son to me. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me, by betraying me, by sleeping with my wife and with the wives of my friends and allies." Olamide remained silent, his head bowed. He knew there was nothing he could say that would change the outcome. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and now he had to face the consequences. One of the village elders, a stern-faced man with a long white beard, stepped forward. "You have brought dishonor to this village," the elder said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You have caused chaos in our homes, and you have left a stain on our community that can never be washed away. For that, you must leave, and you must never return." The men, their faces set in grim determination, pushed Olamide toward the forest. They did not lay hands on him with violence, but their message was clear. If he tried to return, his life would be forfeit. Olamide, understanding that he had no choice, began to walk into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind the village he had once called home. As he walked, the sounds of the village faded away, replaced by the whispers of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Olamide felt a deep sense of loss, but he also knew that he had brought this upon himself. He had allowed his desires to control him, and now he had to pay the price. Back in the village, the men tried to regain control over their households, but the damage had been done. Trust had been shattered, and the seeds of doubt planted by Olamide's actions continued to grow. The women, who had once found solace and pleasure in Olamide's arms, now lived in fear. They knew that their secrets could be exposed at any moment, and they walked on eggshells, afraid that their husbands might discover the truth. Chief Adeyemi, who had once been the most powerful man in the village, was now a shadow of his former self. He could no longer hold his head high, knowing that his wife had betrayed him with a man he had once considered a trusted servant. The other men in the village shared his pain, their pride wounded, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had been deceived. The children born in the aftermath of Olamide's time in the village grew up with questions they could never answer. Some of them looked like their fathers, while others bore a striking resemblance to Olamide. The whispers never fully died down, and the story of Olamide became a cautionary tale, passed down from generation to generation. The women who had been with Olamide never spoke of him again, but they carried the memory of him in their hearts. Some of them remembered him with love, others with regret, but all of them knew that they had been part of something that could never be spoken of openly. Their lives were forever changed by their encounters with Olamide, and they had to live with the consequences of their actions. Olamide wandered the forests and the neighboring villages for many years, never staying in one place for too long. He became a man without a home, always on the move, always looking over his shoulder. He knew that he could never return to his village, But he also knew that his gift was both a blessing and a curse. In his travels, Olamide encountered other villages, other people who had heard of his story. Some welcomed him with open arms, curious to see if the rumors were true. Others turned him away, fearing the chaos he might bring. Olamide learned to live with his gift, but he never forgot the village he had once called home, the village he had been forced to leave behind. As Olamide moved from village to village, he continued to use his gift, but with a newfound caution. He no longer sought out women as he once had. Instead, he allowed them to come to him. He knew the dangers of giving in to his desires, and he was determined not to repeat the mistakes of his past. In one village, he met a young woman named Adeyemi. She was beautiful, with long, flowing hair and a smile that could light up the darkest night. But what drew Olamide to her was not just her beauty. It was her kindness, her gentle spirit. She was different from the other women he had known, and for the first time in a long while, Olamide felt something more than just physical desire. Adeyemi was fascinated by Olamide, by the stories she had heard about him, but she also saw the sadness in his eyes, the burden he carried. She was drawn to him, not just for his looks or his gift, but for the man he was underneath. She saw the pain he tried to hide, and she wanted to help him heal. Olamide and Adeyemi spent many nights together, talking and sharing their stories. Olamide told her of his past, of the village he had been banished from, and of the women he had loved and lost. Adeyemi listened, her heart aching for him, and she offered him the one thing he had not had in a long time: understanding. With Adeyemi's help, Olamide began to heal. He started to see his gift not as a curse, but as a part of who he was. He realized that he had the power to bring both pleasure and pain, and it was up to him to choose how to use it. He no longer sought out the company of many women, instead focusing on the deep connection he had with Adeyemi. The people in Adeyemi's village came to accept Olamide, seeing him not just as a man with a dangerous gift, but as someone who had been through much and come out the other side stronger and wiser. They respected him for the wisdom he had gained from his experiences, and they sought his counsel on matters of the heart. Olamide became a healer of sorts, using his knowledge of the human heart to help those who were lost, those who needed guidance. He found peace in helping others, in using his gift not for his own pleasure, but for the benefit of others. He and Adeyemi grew closer, their bond deepening with each passing day. For the first time in his life, Olamide felt truly content. He had found a place where he was accepted, where he could be himself without fear of judgment. He had found a woman who loved him for who he was, not just for what he could do. And in Adeyemi's arms, Olamide found the peace he had been searching for all his life. Years passed, and Olamide's reputation as a wise and gentle healer spread far and wide. People from neighboring villages would come to seek his counsel, to hear his stories, and to learn from his experiences. Olamide had finally found his place in the world, and he was happy. But back in the village he had once called home, his legacy had not been forgotten. The children he had fathered with the wives of the wealthy and the slave women had grown into strong and capable adults. These children, though born under secretive circumstances, had inherited not only Olamide's physical strength and striking features, but also his wisdom, his charisma, and his ability to unite people. As they grew older, these children began to question the stories they had heard about their father. They knew of the scandal that had surrounded his banishment, but they also knew that there was more to the story. They had heard whispers of how their mothers had been deeply moved by Olamide, how he had treated them with a kindness and respect that was rare in those times. These children, who now formed a considerable part of the village's population, felt a strong desire to know the man who had fathered them, to understand where they had come from. Among these children were the sons and daughters of royalty and wealthy families, who had been raised with privileges and power. These young men and women, respected and influential in their own right, began to speak openly about their desire to bring Olamide back to the village. They approached the village elders, requesting an audience to discuss the matter. The elders, surprised by this unified appeal, agreed to listen. In the gathering, one of Olamide's sons, a tall and imposing figure named Adeyemi, stood before the elders. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of conviction. "We know the story of our father Olamide," Adeyemi began. "We know of the mistakes he made and the pain he caused, but we also know that he is our father, and we have a right to know him. We are strong, we are capable, and we have contributed much to this village. We ask you, as our leaders, to allow him to return." The elders listened intently, but it was not just Adeyemi's words that moved them. It was the sheer number of Olamide's children present in the gathering. There were dozens of them, all grown, strong, and determined. They were sons and daughters of both slaves and free women, of wealthy merchants and royal families, all united in their plea. Another of Olamide's daughters, a beautiful and articulate young woman named Morayo, spoke next. "We understand that our father was banished for his actions, but we also know that he has changed. We have heard of the man he has become, of the good he has done in other villages. We believe that everyone deserves a second chance, especially someone who has given this village so many strong and capable people." The village elders exchanged glances, clearly moved by the passionate appeal of Olamide's children. They had not anticipated this level of unity and determination from the younger generation. The elders, who had lived through the chaos of Olamide's time in the village, could see that these children were not just seeking to reclaim a father. They were seeking to heal a wound that had festered for too long. One of the elders, an old man with a weathered face and wise eyes, spoke up. "What you ask is not a simple matter. Your father caused much pain, and his actions left scars that are still felt today. But we see that you are his legacy, and you have grown into strong and honorable people. Perhaps it is time for us to consider forgiveness." Adeyemi stepped forward again, his voice filled with resolve. "If our father is not allowed to return, then we will leave this village. We cannot stay in a place that refuses to acknowledge our bloodline, our heritage. We will go to him, and you will lose the strength and talent that we bring to this community." This ultimatum sent a ripple of concern through the elders. They could not afford to lose so many valuable members of the community, especially not those who held such influence and power. The thought of a mass exodus of Olamide's children and the impact it would have on the village was too great a risk to take. After much deliberation, the elders finally agreed. "Olamide may return," the elder announced, his voice carrying the weight of the decision. "But he must return as a changed man, one who understands the gravity of his past actions. He will be watched closely, and any misstep will be met with swift consequences. However, we believe that with your support, he can be reintegrated into our community." With the elders' decision, messengers were sent to the village where Olamide had been living. They carried with them the news that he was allowed to return, that his children had spoken on his behalf and won him the chance to come home. Chapter 11: The Homecoming. When Olamide received the message that he was being invited back to the village, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He had long accepted that he would never see his old home again, that he would live out the rest of his days in the village where he had found peace. But the thought of seeing his children, of being accepted by them, filled him with a hope he had not felt in years. Olamide, accompanied by Adeyemi, began the journey back to his village. The walk was long, but each step was filled with anticipation. As they approached the outskirts of the village, Olamide's heart raced. He was nervous, unsure of how he would be received, despite the assurance from the messengers. As they neared the village, Olamide was greeted by a sight that took his breath away. Standing at the entrance of the village were his children, all of them waiting for him. Adebayo, Morayo, and the others he had never met, yet who carried his blood, stood proudly, their faces filled with emotion. They had come to welcome him home. Olamide, overcome with emotion, fell to his knees as his children rushed to embrace him. Tears streamed down his face as he felt their arms around him, their voices calling him Father. It was a moment he had never dreamed would come to pass, a moment of redemption and forgiveness that healed the deepest wounds in his heart. Adebayo, his eldest son, helped him to his feet. "Father, we have waited for this day for so long," Adebayo said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have heard of the man you have become, and we are proud to call you our father. Welcome home." The entire village had gathered to witness Olamide's return. The people watched in awe as Olamide was embraced by his children, who had grown into strong and capable adults. The villagers, who had once whispered about Olamide in scorn, now looked at him with a mix of respect and admiration. They saw the strength and unity of his children, and they knew that Olamide had left a powerful legacy behind. Chief Adeyemi, now frail with age, approached Olamide. The two men looked at each other, and for a moment there was silence. Then, with great effort, Chief Adeyemi spoke. "Olamide, I see now that the man you have become is worthy of the respect and love of your children. I was wrong to think that you could not change. Welcome back, old friend." Olamide, his heart swelling with emotion, nodded. "Thank you, Chief Adeyemi. I have made many mistakes in my life, but I have also learned from them. I am grateful for this second chance." The village elders, who had watched the scene unfold, stepped forward. "Olamide," one of them said, "you have proven that a man can change, that a man can grow. We welcome you back into the village, not as the man you once were, but as the man you have become." The villagers, moved by the elders' words, began to cheer. The sound of their voices filled the air, a sound of acceptance, of unity, of a community that had come together to heal old wounds. Olamide settled back into the village, but this time, he was not the man he once was. He was now a father, a healer, and a respected elder. He and Aduni made their home among the people who had once shunned him, and they were embraced as members of the community. Olamide's children played a significant role in the village, using the strength and wisdom they had inherited from him to lead and protect their people. They were proud of their father, proud of the man he had become, and they ensured that his legacy would be one of love, forgiveness, and unity. The village, once divided by suspicion and mistrust, began to heal. The children who had been born during Olamide's time in the village grew up knowing the full story of their origins, and they were proud of who they were. They knew that their fathers had forgiven Olamide, and they too forgave him, understanding that he had become a better man. Olamide's story became a legend, a tale told by the fireside, passed down from generation to generation. It was a story of love, betrayal, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. And as the years passed, Olamide's name became synonymous with wisdom and compassion. In his old age, Olamide would often sit with Aduni by his side, watching their children and grandchildren play. He would smile, knowing that he had finally found the peace he had been searching for all his life. And as the sun set on the village, casting a golden glow over the land, Olamide would close his eyes, content in the knowledge that he had truly found his place in the world. Years after Olamide's death, the village he had once called home continued to thrive. The people had learned from his story, and they passed down his wisdom to their children and grandchildren. Olamide's legacy lived on, not just in his descendants, but in the hearts of all who had known him. The story of Olamide, the man with the dangerous gift, became a symbol of the power of redemption, the importance of forgiveness, and the strength that comes from facing one's past. And as the generations passed, The tale of Olamide remained a reminder that no matter how far one may fall, there is always a path to redemption and a place to call home.